The aerodrome at St. Omer was less a base of operations and more a sprawling expanse of mud contained by corrugated iron. In the late autumn of 1917, the atmosphere was defined by a pervasive grayness of the sky, the ground, and the canvas hangars that housed the tools of aerial warfare. Among these tools, the Sopwith F.1, christened the Camel by its ground crews for the distinct hump over its synchronized Vickers machine guns, commanded a singular reputation: lethal efficiency coupled with an unforgiving nature. The technical specifications dictated a highly concentrated mass. The engine, the main fuel tank, the pilot, and the twin heavy machine guns were all positioned tightly together within the first few feet of the fuselage. This design choice, while creating the axis for its legendary and abrupt maneuverability, a lethal asset in the chaotic close-quarters engagements of the time, also rendered the aircraft an inverted pendulum on the ground and a vicious challenge in the air. The resulting instability demanded constant, fine correction from the pilot, transforming a routine patrol into an exercise in high-stakes vigilance. The Camel did not so much fly as it was continuously wrestled into submission. It was this notorious characteristic that provided the context for the current detachment of Flight Lieutenant Edward Vance. Vance was not a combat pilot, but an investigator from the Royal Aircraft Factory, tasked with documenting the operational realities of the Camel, specifically, the failures that occurred outside the established narrative of successful combat. His focus was not on the victories that accumulated the highest kill count among Allied fighters, but on the silent, structural losses. A week prior, Camel D982, flown by a highly experienced pilot, Captain Arthur Selby, had been lost approximately 20 miles east of the lines. The official record cited pilot error due to exhaustion, a common and convenient classification. However, the accompanying report from the recovery team was anomalous. The wreckage indicated a sudden, violent structural failure in the air, but the aircraft had not been engaged by the enemy. Selby, known for his clinical attention to detail and impeccable flight records, was not prone to the errors associated with fatigue. The structural stresses that had torn D982 apart pointed toward an inherent, possibly undocumented, weakness exacerbated by the Camel's unique handling demands. Vance's workspace was clinical, a folding table inside a drafty hut, covered with blueprints, stress analysis reports, and photographs of broken wood and fabric. The detachment's mission was to compile an objective archival history, a document that detailed how the machine truly failed, divorced from the morale-preserving accounts distributed by the ministry. The story of the Sopwith Camel was currently one of unmitigated triumph. Vance's task was to catalog its secret history of self-destruction. The journey from St. Omer to the temporary clearing near Vimy Ridge was defined by a landscape of methodical devastation. The roads, pulverized by supply convoys, were navigable only by low-speed staff car. The move itself reinforced the isolation requested by the irregular cable. Vance traveled alone, transporting only his analytical instruments, field journal, and the strictly limited files concerning structural load reports. The further east he progressed, the more the war shifted from a logistical problem to an environmental one, a terrain actively hostile to human and machine alike. The receiving site was not an aerodrome, but a secluded, camouflaged depot overseen by a small detachment of engineers, not airmen. The atmosphere was one of silent utility. Every action was economical and devoid of the characteristic bustle of a fighting squadron. Vance was led immediately to a small, protected inspection area, a tent lit by a single, powerful oil lamp. Component X7 rested on a low trestle table. The object was identifiable upon sight to any technical observer: the main spar of a Camel's lower starboard wing. This spar bore the immense torsional and bending forces generated by the rotary engine's inertia and the abrupt, heavy-handed control inputs of the pilot, the very stresses that define the aircraft's challenging performance. The spar, constructed of laminated spruce, was approximately 6 feet in length and terminated abruptly where it met the fuselage's lower longerons. Vance's initial examination confirmed that the piece had originated from a Camel, evidenced by the distinct bolt pattern used to attach the interplane struts. What was immediately irregular was the nature of the damage at the root. Standard structural failure, whether from combat or extreme maneuver, typically resulted in splintered, delaminate wood consistent with material fatigue or high-impact stress. Here, the failure was different. The wood grain was not shattered. It exhibited an unnaturally smooth break, a clinical shear running straight across the span where the spar entered the fuselage bay. The rupture was almost surgical. More crucially, the surface of the fractured wood contained physical evidence of something foreign. Embedded in the spruce fibers and surrounding the main attachment points were faint, almost imperceptible abrasions and discoloration. These marks suggested that an additional fitting, likely metal and certainly non-standard, had been bolted onto the spar at the point of maximum stress and had then been violently torn away. The phantom fitting had been an amateur, or at least unauthorized, reinforcement effort. Vance began the laborious process of documenting the failure under high magnification, using a graphite pencil to trace the clean shear line in his journal. The data contradicted the official design tolerances he carried in his satchel. The Sopwith factory had designed the Camel spar to withstand forces well beyond normal operating limits. For a structural piece to fail with this specific, clean rupture, it indicated that either the load applied was astronomically high, or that the non-standard fitting had created a disastrous new stress riser, a single point of weakness that defeated the entire structural integrity. The latter was a far more plausible and disturbing scenario. The component was not just a piece of wreckage. It was evidence of a clandestine modification, a desperate measure implemented in the field to counter a known, fatal flaw in the Camel's concentrated design. This modification had not fixed the problem. It had simply relocated the point of catastrophic failure. The component was silent, but its history was now visibly imprinted in the cleanly severed wood fibers. Vance had a profound certainty. This failure was directly linked to the inexplicable loss of Captain Selby's D-982. The question was no longer if a flaw existed, but who knew about it, and why the evidence was now being handled under conditions of absolute secrecy. On the table lay an official cable, delivered just before the evening watch. It was brief and lacked any standard military header, which was itself irregular. It directed Vance to cease all current documentation on D-982. A new assignment was noted. Proceed immediately to an undisclosed temporary field near Vimy Ridge to examine a newly recovered piece of wreckage. The object was identified only by a coded reference, Component X7. The final instruction was explicit. The inspection and subsequent report must be conducted with absolute isolation from the existing records and must contain no reference to Selby's loss. The trail of Camel D-982 had abruptly gone cold, replaced by a new and seemingly unrelated enigma. With the clean shear of Component X7 documented, Flight Lieutenant Vance's task shifted from verifying the nature of the failure to identifying its origin. The spar was an artifact of desperation, and the materials used for the unauthorized reinforcement were the only remaining signature of the individuals involved. Vance systematically analyzed the faint metallic residues embedded in the spruce fibers surrounding the fatal attachment points. Initial chemical tests confirmed the metallic deposits were a high-carbon steel alloy, standard issue for heavy-duty fastenings and structural fittings in many engineering units. The material itself offered no unique identifier. The crucial evidence, Vance realized, lay in the geometry of the absence, the void left by the torn-off component, and the human alterations made to the standardized frame. Vance focused his attention on the bolt holes. The Camel spars were drilled with absolute precision at the factory. However, the 3 holes used for the phantom fitting were subtly elongated and offset, indicating they had been drilled in the field, likely by hand, to accommodate a plate that did not precisely match the factory specifications. This suggested a hurried, localized effort, bypassing the methodical procedures of a central repair depot. Using an illuminated magnifying glass, Vance methodically scanned the innermost surface of the severed spar root. Nestled deep within the recess where the wood met the main metal fuselage attachment plate, he found it, a minuscule indentation, a tool mark not left by the original assembly. It was a triangular symbol, crudely etched, barely a quarter-inch across. It was not an official inspector's stamp, nor was it a recognized unit marking. It was, rather, the spontaneous, localized signature of a specific workshop or an individual technician. Vance produced a small, leather-bound notebook, a private registry of non-standard markings he had compiled over months of investigating field modifications across various aircraft types. The triangular mark was listed under a notation associated with a batch of poorly calibrated drilling tools known to have been assigned to an engineering section briefly attached to No. 45 Squadron, the very unit that had lost Captain Selby's Camel D-982. The conclusion was inescapable: the attempt to fix the structural flaw in the Camel, the fatal modification evidenced in X-7, had not been an anonymous attempt by a distant repair depot, but a localized secret implemented by the ground crew of the deceased pilot's own squadron. This shifted the inquiry from a material failure to a human conspiracy of silence. It meant that the pilots, or at least the non-commissioned officers maintaining the aircraft, were aware of a deficiency so severe that they risked court-martial and structural disaster to counter it, all without official acknowledgement. The absolute isolation imposed by the mysterious cable was now a dangerous liability. Vance understood he could not submit a technical report linking X-7 to No. 45 Squadron without exposing the entire secret operation. He had reached the limits of forensic metallurgy and stress analysis. The only path forward required re-entering the chaotic, watchful atmosphere of the aerodrome, not as a detached factory investigator, but as an operative seeking human intelligence. He packed his instruments, the image of the crude, triangular symbol overriding the complex geometry of the Sopwith blueprints. He was returning to St. Omer to interview the silent witnesses, the mechanics who had signed their desperate, unauthorized work with a triangle. Flight Lieutenant Vance returned to the St. Omer Aerodrome under the pretense of a general material quality control audit, a broad and nonspecific assignment that allowed him access without raising immediate suspicion regarding specific crash investigations. His objective was singular: to locate the origin of the triangular tool mark within the engineering section of No. 45 Squadron. The maintenance bays were a sensory overload, a loud, chaotic environment saturated with the smell of hot oil, acetone, and aviation fuel. The air was thick with the percussive sound of hammer against metal and the metallic whine of rotary engines undergoing maintenance run-ups. The atmosphere was actively hostile to quiet inquiry. Vance sought out Sergeant Major Davies, the chief mechanic, a man whose competence was known to be matched only by his fierce loyalty to his men and the reputation of the machines they kept flying. Davies was a formidable figure, his uniform perpetually stained by engine grease. He met Vance's technical questions with professional curtness. Vance initiated the conversation by referencing general factory reports regarding potential stress fatigue in the lower wing attachments of the Camel, a neutral technical inquiry that avoided any mention of D-982 or component X-7. "We are conducting an assessment of field modifications that might improve longevity under extreme torsional loads," Vance stated, holding a blueprint sheet detailing the main spar attachment point. "Have your men, in the pursuit of routine maintenance, devised any non-standard methods to alleviate stress in this area? Perhaps specialized jigs for alignment or minor reinforcements?" Davies's expression remained neutral, a practiced mask of bureaucratic compliance. He conceded that the nature of the Camel's concentrated mass, combined with the pilot's aggressive control movements, often led to higher than expected wear on the lower spar roots. However, he maintained a rigid denial of any structural modification. "The Sopwith is a factory machine, Lieutenant. We follow the book. Any work outside of standard maintenance is logged and approved through depot channels. We have no record of structural work." Vance knew this was a carefully constructed lie of omission. He decided to introduce the specific detail he had uncovered. He circled a point on the blueprint corresponding to the location of the triangular indentation. "I understand, but let us consider the tools themselves. Has a new, perhaps temporary, drilling or alignment jig been fabricated locally? Something with a distinct, triangular registration pin to ensure proper fitment for a standard inspection plate?" The sergeant major's composure fractured for a precise, silent second. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in calculation. This specific, obscure knowledge had pierced his defensive perimeter. He adjusted his stance and finally offered a concession, framing it as an abandoned project. "Ah, The alignment jig, Davies confirmed, his voice now lower. Yes, that was Corporal James. He was trialing a stress distribution plate, a temporary thing, believing it would reduce play. He machined a jig to fit it. It was unauthorized, a non-starter. I ordered it scrapped 2 weeks ago. It proved ineffective and was too heavy. Vance had confirmation. Corporal James was the technician responsible for the modification and, therefore, the key to understanding the fatal flaw the squadron was attempting to mask. The sergeant major's lie was now a partial truth. The effort existed, but was dismissed as ineffective and scrapped to minimize culpability. The fact that component X7 had been recovered from a site away from this squadron, yet bearing James's mark, suggested the modification had been deployed on operational aircraft like D-982, and its failure was far from a non-starter. Davies, sensing he had given away too much, moved to end the conversation. Corporal James is currently working on an engine mount in Bay 3. You may ask him about his unauthorized jig, Lieutenant. He will confirm its lack of success. Vance proceeded to Bay 3. The corporal, a man of quiet intensity and worn hands, was bent over the nose of a camel, wrestling with the heavy engine cowl. He did not look up, but his posture, rigid and slow, conveyed the immediate awareness of Vance's presence. He was the only man in the entire aerodrome who knew the silent geometry of component X7 and the unspoken reason Captain Selby's plane had broken apart in a clear sky. The air in Bay 3 was heavy with the metallic scent of exhaust and the faint, sweet aroma of castor oil vaporizing off the engine casings. Corporal James remained fixed on his work, tightening a cowl fastening, acknowledging Flight Lieutenant Vance's presence only with a slight stiffening of his shoulders. Vance did not initiate the conversation with authority or accusation. The clinical nature of his investigation demanded truth, not disciplinary action. Corporal James, Vance began, his voice level against the clamor of the bay. I am here regarding the stress distribution plate you designed. Sergeant Major Davies described it as an unauthorized, ineffective non-starter, since scrapped. James finally lowered his spanner and turned, his face a landscape of fatigue and apprehension. That's the official line, Lieutenant. The official line is contradicted by material evidence. Vance continued, maintaining eye contact. I have examined a lower spar route that carries the unique signature of your tooling jig, a crude triangular registration mark. The damage indicates catastrophic failure initiated precisely at the point where your plate was attached, not factory standard failure. The piece was not scrapped, it failed in the air. The corporal did not flinch, only nodded once, a gesture of weary confirmation. The plate created a stress riser, sir. We were trying to distribute the strain, but we concentrated it instead. It was a failure of the attempt, not the diagnosis. Vance pressed the true core of the technical failure. What was the diagnosis? The Camel is known for its heavy controls and its concentrated mass. Where was the fatigue developing that demanded this measure? James wiped his hands on a rag, speaking now with the practiced, precise language of a man who understood the machinery intimately. It was the spin recovery, sir. Or, rather, the extreme end of the combat turn. The rotary engine torque, combined with full rudder input, creates a momentary, violent oscillation in the fuselage structure itself. We called it the wing whip. The lower spar joint flexed too much on the starboard side. After intense flying, the spruce was starting to delaminate at the root attachment, microfractures invisible to a standard inspection. We couldn't ground the aircraft for what was dismissed as normal wear. The truth now fully emerged. The Camel's highly concentrated mass, its source of lethal agility, was actively compromising the structural integrity of the wings during its signature maneuvers. And who precisely mandated this risk? Vance inquired. Who requested an unauthorized fix that carried the risk of creating a new weakness, rather than reporting the defect? James hesitated, glancing briefly toward the office of the chief mechanic before speaking so quietly Vance had to step closer. Captain Selby, sir. D-982. He felt the whip more than others. He flew the machine harder, at the limits the factory never tested. He knew the risk. He insisted we reinforce his plane first, claiming that the structural deficiency would kill more pilots than the enemy ever could if the problem wasn't addressed now. Selby had not been a victim of pilot exhaustion. He had been a victim of his own calculated attempt to defeat a hidden design flaw, using a makeshift remedy. The trail of D-982, officially closed, had violently reopened, revealing that the pilot was complicit in the mechanical destruction of his own machine. James reached under his workbench and pulled out a small, grease-smeared accounting ledger. It was bound in thick leather and secured with a broken bootlace. "This is the real record, Lieutenant, not the one for the depot. It details every plane we modified, the dates, the pilots, and the specific material we used. It was the only way to track which camels carried the hidden stress riser. If they catch me, they'll burn this. I want you to have it." The ledger contained not only the truth about D-982, but the list of every other camel in the squadron that now flew with a ticking clock in its lower wing. The leather-bound ledger, warm from Corporal James's pocket and faintly slick with oil, was an archive of lethal compromise. Vance retreated to his isolated hut, locking the flimsy wooden door against the noises of the aerodrome. He placed the book on the table beside his technical reports, the contrast between the factory-issued documents and the mechanic's private record underscoring the divide between official doctrine and operational reality. The first step was securing the data. Vance photographed every page of the ledger with his compact technical camera, ensuring the brittle paper and faded ink were preserved digitally. Only then did he begin the clinical analysis of the contents. The ledger was meticulously organized, a testament to Corporal James's dedication to accuracy. It cataloged 22 camels, approximately a third of the squadron's complement, that had been fitted with the unauthorized stress distribution plate. Each entry included the aircraft serial number, the date of modification, the specific gauge of steel plate used, varying based on available scrap metal, and crucially, a running total of the aircraft's accumulated high-G flight hours. James had effectively created his own structural fatigue index, tracking the aircraft most exposed to the violent wing whip. Vance cross-referenced these flight hours with the dates of recent operational sorties. A chilling pattern emerged. The three camels with the highest fatigue indices, the machines most likely to suffer the same catastrophic failure as D-982, were consistently assigned to the most demanding and dangerous missions: long-range reconnaissance, deep penetration escorts for heavy bombers, and low-level ground strafing runs. These missions required sustained, high-stress maneuvering, precisely the conditions that guaranteed the failure of the modified spar. The revelation created a profound shift in Vance's perspective. He had initially viewed the modifications as a desperate, unauthorized attempt by a pilot and his crew to solve an endemic flaw. Now he saw the systemic exploitation of that flaw. If the squadron hierarchy, or elements within it, knew which aircraft carried the ticking time bomb of the stress riser, the assignment of these planes to high-risk engagements became an act of calculated disposal. This suspicion was compounded by the second layer of data, the pilots assigned to these aircraft. While Captain Selby, an ace, had initiated the program on his own plane, the current assignments showed a disproportionate number of new, low-hour pilots flying the most compromised machines. Selby had flown his own modified Camel hard and died. The newer pilots were being sacrificed through simple, fatal assignment. Vance focused on one particular Camel, E-8114, which was scheduled for a patrol sortie the following morning. Its fatigue hours exceeded those of the lost D-982 by a factor of 10, and it was assigned to a recently arrived pilot, Lieutenant Thomas, who had only 5 hours of combat experience. The immediate operational threat was now undeniable. He possessed documented proof that the squadron was knowingly fielding structurally unsound aircraft, effectively using pilots to test the failure limits of a secret defect. However, acting on the ledger meant revealing the unauthorized modifications, subjecting Corporal James and Sergeant Major Davies to certain criminal charges, and undermining the entire operational morale of the fighting squadron. The calculus was exposure versus immediate safety. Vance knew the official military channels would bury the ledger for morale, just as they had buried Selby's death. He had to intervene directly before E-8114 took off in the morning. Vance had less than 2 hours before the morning patrol was scheduled to launch. Intervention required immediate, official action, but using the ledger as evidence was impossible, as it would instantly compromise Corporal James and nullify the objective of his original, secret mission. He had to manufacture a credible, untraceable reason to ground Camel E-8114. He approached the squadron commander's office, a temporary structure that offered minimal insulation against the cold and the responsibility it contained. Major Ellington, the officer in charge, was immersed in operational planning, his map table crowded with the movements of ground formations and enemy interception zones. Vance presented himself, requesting an immediate audience regarding an urgent technical matter. He bypassed the fatigue analysis pretext and employed a tactic derived from his deep knowledge of the Camel's known, documented deficiencies, those that were accepted but never publicly highlighted. Major, Vance stated, his tone strictly formal. I have conducted an immediate, unscheduled inspection focusing on material batch tolerances. Specifically, the lower starboard spar assembly. Our data suggests a slight variance in the wood density and lamination quality for the batch used in aircraft in the E-8000 series. This is a factory error, not a maintenance issue. Ellington looked up, irritation mingling with surprise. Material tolerances? Lieutenant, these machines are needed at dawn. Do you have a quantifiable reason to ground a serviceable fighter? I do, Major. The concentration of mass in the Camel makes it extremely susceptible to asymmetric structural decay when combined with minute material defects. The aircraft in question, E-8114, has logged a statistically significant number of high-stress maneuvers, combat turns and spins, that place it in a high-risk category for lower wing spar failure. The risk is immediate and structural. Ellington was a combat officer, his decisions predicated on immediate tactical necessity, not statistical probability. We are at war, Lieutenant. Every Camel in the air carries a risk. If this is merely a risk based on a slight variance, I cannot justify grounding a mission. Vance pushed his argument, relying on the truth of the ledger without naming it. It is not a slight variance, Major. E-8114 has accumulated what we define as critical high G hours. Its history of extreme torque stress is far beyond the nominal average for this squadron. If that aircraft performs a full throttle, tight turn at medium altitude, the spar will fail, resulting in total wing separation. The data is empirical. The severity of Vance's warning, delivered with absolute technical certainty, finally arrested the Major's attention. Ellington understood that a structural loss, especially one leading to a visible wing failure, would be far more damaging to morale and subsequent investigation than a conventional combat loss. Give me a temporary justification, Ellington demanded. Something I can log that will stand up to the wing commander's inquiry without triggering an internal audit on every machine. Vance seized the narrow opening. The main rotary engine mountings on E-8114 are likely overstressed due to the high G usage. Request a 24-hour hold 4 engine bed inspection and torque sleeve replacement. This is a critical, but routine, maintenance issue. Ellington picked up his logbook, his decision made. The integrity of the operational schedule had been compromised by the immediate need for self-preservation. He logged the grounding request and signed the corresponding order, assigning the young pilot, Lieutenant Thomas, to a reserve machine. Vance had saved a life and neutralized the most immediate threat from the ledger, but he had merely bought time. The 3 most compromised Camels, E-8114, F-9031, and G-7005, were still in the squadron. The true mystery, why the hierarchy was knowingly risking the lives of low-hour pilots on these specific, compromised airframes, remained unresolved and pointed towards a deliberate, systemic act of concealment that extended far beyond Sergeant Major Davies's hangar. The temporary grounding of E-8114 afforded Vance a brief reprieve, but the suspicion of deliberate misconduct remained. He returned to the pages of the ledger, shifting his focus from the mechanics of failure to the operational context of the flying hours. The critical high G time noted by James was one variable. The specific nature of the missions flown was the next crucial piece of the puzzle. Vance procured the official mission logs for the past 3 weeks, ostensibly for a comparative study on pilot exhaustion rates. He cross-referenced the flight paths of the 22 compromised Camels with the standard sorties, patrols, escorts, and combat air patrols. An immediate, subtle anomaly appeared. While the compromised aircraft, including the lost D-982, were indeed assigned to the most hazardous combat missions. A significant percentage of their flight time was dedicated to unusual, low-altitude, short-hop flights immediately following heavy, localized engagements. These were not combat or patrol missions, but rapid courier runs between the forward aerodromes and the Corps headquarters located 30 to 50 miles behind the lines. The official designation was urgent dispatch. Vance investigated the nature of the dispatches. They were not carrying critical orders, which were handled by dedicated communication units. Instead, the flights were transporting documentation, detailed, handwritten reports concerning the precise location, severity, and resulting casualties of localized artillery bombardments. The critical factor was the speed of delivery. The Corps commanders demanded ground truth casualty counts and ordnance consumption data almost immediately after the fighting subsided, requiring the fastest possible transport over muddy, contested roads. The question then became, why use the structurally compromised camels, piloted by the least experienced flyers, for this mundane logistical task? A new pilot was already at a disadvantage in a camel, placing him in a damaged aircraft for a low-altitude, high-speed flight across the immediate rear lines increased the risk exponentially. The answer lay in the economy of risk. Every available, reliable camel was required for combat duty to maintain air superiority. The compromised camels, the ones known to the engineering section to be ticking structural failures, were unsuitable for sustained, high-G combat, where a wing whip could prove fatal. However, for a one-way, high-speed dash that required no complex maneuvering, the wing spar would likely hold. The compromised aircraft were being used as expendable, single-use high-speed courier platforms. The system had found a practical, cynical function for a batch of structurally unsound machines and their inexperienced pilots. It was not malicious disposal for revenge or internal feud, but a cold, bureaucratic decision based on resource management. They were risking a young pilot's life and a structurally compromised asset to satisfy an administrative demand for faster paperwork, the logistical anomaly. Vance understood the trap. Reporting the structural defect would expose the entire fleet to grounding, crippling combat operations. Reporting the logistical misuse would expose a senior officer's calculation of acceptable losses for administrative efficiency. He needed to identify the originator of this specific urgent dispatch protocol, the man who had authored the compromise. He traced the dispatch routing back through the air wing logistics files. The specific instruction to use fighter assets for the rapid documentation transport originated not from the squadron, but from a temporary directive issued by a colonel stationed at the Wing Command headquarters near the coast. This man, Colonel Richard Selwyn, was known to prioritize the rapid consolidation of data above all operational considerations. Crucially, the records showed that Colonel Selwyn had once served as Captain Selby's flight commander. The trail of the wing whip, the clean shear, and the ledger had led not to a mechanical problem, but to a calculating superior officer who had a connection to the first casualty. The headquarters of Wing Command was a world away from the mud and urgency of the forward aerodrome. Located in a repurposed, stately manor house further west, it embodied the institutional distance between strategic planning and the physical reality of combat. Flight Lieutenant Vance's mission was now one of direct confrontation with the author of the Urgent Dispatch Protocol, Colonel Richard Selwyn. Vance presented his formal authorization papers, documentation related to factory oversight of field directives, granting him access to the logistical officer who initiated the courier protocol. Colonel Selwyn was a man of precise movements and immaculate uniform, the physical antithesis of the exhausted ground crews Vance had just left. Selwyn's office was dominated by charts detailing operational tempo and resource consumption, reinforcing his identity as an officer whose priorities lay in bureaucratic efficiency and data fidelity. Vance opened the conversation by challenging the logistical premise of the directive. "Colonel, my investigation into material failure rates has flagged the urgent dispatch protocol as a significant risk factor. The use of high-performance fighter assets, specifically the Sopwith Camel, for low-altitude courier runs places undue, rapid fatigue on the airframes, accelerating structural decay." Selwyn leaned back, accepting the technical premise without concern. "Lieutenant, data is the lubricant of modern warfare. The Corps needs accurate ordnance expenditure and casualty counts hours, not days, after the action. Road transport is unreliable. A 20-minute flight in a fighter is a justifiable risk against the need for timely ground truth. We have calculated the acceptable rate of attrition for this task. And what is the acceptable rate for structural failure in this context, Colonel? The Camel's concentrated mass makes it acutely vulnerable to the wing whip during stress maneuvers. Utilizing Camels known to have structural issues, the older, high-hour airframes, for this task is a deliberate sacrifice of asset and pilot to satisfy an administrative timeline. The Colonel's eyes remained steady, cold, and entirely focused on the ledger of the war, not the ledger Vance carried in his satchel. The decision is logistical, Lieutenant. We use the most expendable assets for tasks that require speed and low exposure to sustained combat. If an aircraft is deemed less reliable for a high-G dogfight, it is redeployed to a high-speed, low-G courier flight. This conserves the elite, reliable machines for combat superiority. The explanation was cold, ruthless, and entirely consistent with a detached, systemic view of war, a purely administrative choice to maintain the combat edge by spending the lives of new pilots and the weakest airframes on high-speed paperwork. It was a victory of bureaucracy over humanity. However, Vance had one final, non-technical piece of information to introduce: the personal connection. Captain Arthur Selby, lost in D-982, was the pilot who first attempted the unauthorized reinforcement that caused the fatal structural riser. Records show he flew under your command at 45 Squadron. Did Captain Selby ever raise concerns to you about the Camel's structural stability before his death? A minute fissure appeared in Colonel Selwyn's composure. The mention of Selby's name, specifically tied to the unauthorized act, elicited a visible reaction. Selwyn confirmed the relationship with a controlled sharpness. Selby was a brilliant pilot, but structurally reckless. He pushed the Camel beyond its design limits for personal glory. He requested mechanical allowances that were administratively denied because they were unsafe. He was reckless, Lieutenant, and reckless men pay the highest cost in this war. His death was self-inflicted, not systemic. Selwyn's denial was too vehement, too dismissive of Selby's technical insight. Vance recognized the tone. It was not administrative justification, but personal judgment disguised as official policy. The twist was not merely bureaucratic. It was rooted in a personal conflict between a rule-bound commander and a risk-taking pilot, leading to a fatal, calculated neglect. Selwyn hadn't just used the faulty planes for logistics. He had, perhaps subconsciously, designated the Camels that bore Selby's desperate fix as the most expendable in the fleet. Following the charged meeting with Colonel Selwyn, Flight Lieutenant Vance requested access to the Wing Command's comprehensive aircraft assignment and pilot rotation archive, citing the need to correlate material batch numbers with overall usage logs across multiple squadrons. This allowed him to operate within the sterile, temperature-controlled environment of the records vault, far from the direct supervision of operational officers. The vault contained the detailed history of every pilot's progression and every aircraft's service life. Vance's task was to map the cold, empirical data from Corporal James's hidden ledger, the list of 22 structurally compromised Camels, onto the official assignment rosters authored by Colonel Selwyn's department. The initial correlation was statistically damning. The cohort of new pilots, defined as those possessing less than 20 hours of combat flight time in the Camel, had been assigned to the ledger's aircraft at a rate 3 times higher than the squadron average. The distribution was not random. It was a non-negotiable directive that flowed from Wing Command. Vance then analyzed the written assignment protocols themselves. Within the internal documentation concerning the urgent dispatch flights, he found a section labeled Asset Optimization. It was a short paragraph authored by Selwyn and initialed by a senior staff officer. The text justified the use of fighter assets for courier work, but included a precise, chilling instruction. To maintain combat superiority, airframes categorized as high fatigue or structurally divergent are to be prioritized for low-G, rapid transport tasks, invariably assigned to personnel in the initial operational phase who require routine familiarization hours. The clinical language, structurally divergent and initial operational phase, was a direct, bureaucratic translation of compromised aircraft and inexperienced pilots. Selwyn had not simply neglected to review the maintenance risks. He had formalized the pairing, weaponizing the structural flaw for logistical gain, using the expendable assets to preserve the reliable ones. The final piece of the archival puzzle involved Captain Selby. Vance searched through the records of Selwyn's tenure as Selby's flight commander. He found a memorandum dated 5 months prior to D-982's crash. It was a formal complaint filed by Captain Selby regarding a specific design recommendation he had submitted to the Royal Aircraft Factory. Selby argued that the concentrated mass of the Camel required a specific, expensive metal reinforcement ring at the wing root to manage the torsional stress of combat spins. Colonel Selwyn's handwritten comment, scrawled dismissively across the bottom of the memorandum, provided the emotional context for the structural sacrifice. Selwyn wrote, "Obsessive. This pilot is trying to legislate against his own recklessness. Recommendation denied. His insistence on pushing the envelope requires a structural discipline that this design does not owe him." Selwyn had known the exact nature of the structural fatigue that the pilot was attempting to fix and had dismissed it not on technical grounds, but on a moral judgment of Selby's flying style. When Selby took matters into his own hands and attempted the unauthorized fix, Selwyn's administrative system provided the perfect mechanism for consequence. The Ledger's aircraft, those bearing the mark of Selby's recklessness, were designated for sacrifice to the war machine's logistical requirements. The assignment matrix was not just policy, it was fatal, posthumous arbitration. Vance now possessed the objective proof, a trail of paperwork confirming intentional, systemic negligence driven by a personal agenda. The archival record was complete. Flight Lieutenant Vance spent a measured evening synthesizing the 3 disparate streams of evidence: the technical failure, Component X7's clean shear and the stress riser; the human conspiracy, Corporal James's ledger detailing the 22 compromised airframes; and the bureaucratic motive, Colonel Selwyn's asset optimization directive and the handwritten note confirming his prejudice against Captain Selby's safety warnings. The final report was a masterpiece of cold, detached technical writing. It avoided all emotional language, relying solely on data correlations and documented policy to build its case. It began not with the death of Captain Selby, but with the specific metallurgical and wood stress analysis of the recovered spar fragment, Component X7. It systematically traced the unauthorized fix to the known wing whip phenomenon, then used James's ledger to establish the scope of the field modification. The core of the accusation rested on the final section, which presented the statistical pairing of the structurally divergent aircraft with initial operational phase pilots, demonstrating a clear, codified risk assessment where new lives were deemed expendable for logistical gain. Vance formally submitted the document, titled An Analytical Review of Operational Tolerance and Systemic Risk in Sopwith F.1 Airframes, through the established chain of command to the Inspector General's office, bypassing wing command entirely. He knew that by making the submission, he was ensuring 2 outcomes: the immediate, critical examination of the Sopwith Camel's design and the professional annihilation of Corporal James, Sergeant Major Davies, and Colonel Selwyn. The response was swift, silent, and absolute. Within 24 hours, a specialized engineering team arrived at the aerodrome from the main depot, not in their usual technical lorries, but accompanied by military police. Their immediate and sole task was the systematic, overnight grounding of every Camel in the E-8000 serial batch and those marked in James's ledger. The Camels were not immediately taken off the base, but simply stripped of their propellers and ignition components, rendering them inert. The spectacle of the entire operational fleet being suddenly and unilaterally disabled sent a visible tremor of confusion through the entire squadron. The investigation into the personnel was equally clinical. Sergeant Major Davies and Corporal James were placed under arrest, charged with gross insubordination and the illegal modification of war assets, the bureaucratic price for their attempt to save lives. Colonel Selwyn, however, was not arrested. A terse, internal memorandum circulated the next day, announcing his transfer to a non-operational administrative post in London, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic priorities. Selwyn had not been broken by the investigation. He had simply been moved sideways, his career continuity prioritized over criminal accountability. Vance was directed to remain in France. His initial investigative mission was terminated, replaced by a new, permanent assignment to oversee the installation of new, factory-mandated reinforcement rings on all existing camels, correcting the defect Captain Selby had fatally identified. The fix was being implemented, the flaw acknowledged, but the human cost of the cover-up remained unevenly distributed. Vance had won the technical battle for the airframe, but lost the moral battle for the men he sought to protect. The system had absorbed the truth, corrected the design, and purged the inconvenient personnel, maintaining its polished narrative of operational necessity. The aerodrome at Saint-Omer, once a symbol of operational urgency, had become a vast, sprawling repair depot. Flight Lieutenant Vance's new mandate consumed his days. He stood knee-deep in wood shavings and metal filings, supervising the installation of the factory-mandated metal reinforcement rings, the exact structural solution Captain Selby had proposed and Colonel Selwyn had dismissed months before. The design flaw was now officially corrected, acknowledged not with fanfare, but with the quiet, persistent clang of hammers against steel. Vance was effective, meticulous, and utterly alone. His new position was an administrative prison. He was respected by the visiting engineers, but treated with reserved caution by the remaining squadron personnel. He was the man who had brought down the hammer, the man who had exchanged the lives of 22 pilots for the careers of 2 honest mechanics and the comfortable exile of a negligent colonel. The ledger, the physical proof of sacrifice, was now secured in an Inspector General's safe in London. Corporal James and Sergeant Major Davies were serving their sentences, the official record citing their gross negligence leading to structural destabilization of combat assets. They had saved lives but violated the sacred order of bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy demanded its pound of flesh. Colonel Selwyn, safely placed in a desk job, would eventually retire on a full pension, his career continuity unbroken by the small matter of expendable pilots. As Vance watched a mechanic slot the new, thick reinforcement ring over a lower spar root, the exact point where component X7 had suffered its clean shear, he felt the weight of the war's true nature. The great conflicts of the air, the dramatic dogfights, and the soaring victories were merely the visible membrane of a far more potent and invisible force. The ultimate danger was not the enemy's guns, nor even the technical limitations of the machine, but the impersonal, self-preserving system that calculated the value of information and morale above the value of a life. Captain Selby had been right. He had seen the flaw, tried to fix it, and died trying to bypass the official structure that would have buried his warning. Selwyn had simply expedited the inevitable, using the damaged assets for a paper chase. Vance, the forensic analyst, had merely forced the system to correct its product and police its internal dissent. His task was over, but his education had just begun. He looked out across the hangar. The camels, grounded but soon to fly again, were receiving their protection, the ring that was the ghost of Captain Selby's original idea. Vance picked up his journal, noting the serial number of the last airframe to be fitted. His report was closed. The war continued, louder and more chaotic than ever. But Vance knew a silent truth now. The battlefield was vast, encompassing the cockpit and the office, and the casualties were often taken not by fire, but by paperwork. He closed the book, accepting his role as the necessary, silent guardian of the machine, a man who had traded his detachment for a terrible, permanent knowledge.